So Jodi is a qualified ranger with 15 years experience in conservation and natural resources management, primarily as a senior ranger for wildlife rehabilitation and rescue, with a particular interest in seabirds. Additionally, Jodi's interests and skills span across habitat health and restoration, fire response and ecology, and emergency response preparedness. I'd like to welcome to the stage Jodi Bellett with little penguins on Phillip Island. Do you need this one, or do you want to stand on the stand? So there's your forward and next one, and that's your later.
Right. Thanks very much, Helen, for the introduction. Really pleased to be here today, especially among so many knowledgeable and passionate people. It's exciting to have the opportunity to share some of the work that we do with little penguins on Malau, Phillip Island. We're going to talk about a study into the long-term success of penguin rehabilitation over a 12-year period, and also the increased challenges and threats of heat waves and the warming climate. And just a heads up for those of you following through with your books, these slides have been reviewed and updated since then, so they might be markedly different. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and waters on which we're meeting, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and the traditional owners of the land and waters of Malau, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, where I'm lucky enough to live and work. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend those respects to all Aboriginal persons here with us today, whether that be online or in person. I also recognise their role in caring for country over thousands of years and acknowledge the true history and their continued connection to the place as we work and walk together. So Phillip Island Nature Parks is a conservation-led organisation funded primarily through ecotourism experiences on Phillip Island, including the world-renowned Penguin Parade, pictured here. It's located around 120 kilometres south of Melbourne in Victoria, and the Nature Parks was created by the Victorian State Government in the mid-90s and manages just shy of 2,000 hectares of Crown land. Also part of the UNESCO Western Port Biosphere Reserve, and these areas are protected and managed by our environmental and research programs. Originally, just a little bit of history, there were 10 penguin colonies located on Phillip Island. Unfortunately, by the 1980s, there was only one remaining on the Summerland Peninsula. Researchers predicted that by the late 1990s, this colony would also be lost. So incredibly, the Victorian State Government bought back the entire housing estate on the Summerland Peninsula and gave that land back to the little penguins. Extensive conservation work alongside this program have brought the little penguins back from a population in the 1980s of about 12,000 birds to the current population of 40,000 breeding birds. Thank you. Yes, something that we are incredibly happy about. So maybe just a hands up, how many people in this room care for or have cared for little penguins over the years? Great, excellent, lots of you. You can probably take a little nap for this slide. For those of you, however, who are less familiar with little penguins, just like to share a bit of information about them. They are the smallest of the 18 species. They stand around 30 centimetres high and weigh on average around 1 kilo. They're also the only penguins with blue feathers. They're located along the coastlines of southern Australia, even got them here in WA, and also in New Zealand. The current population is just over 469,000 penguins, and they are listed as least concern on the red list, which is great. The current population trend is stable. However, there are some areas where there are localised decreases. We're lucky enough to have the largest little penguin colony on Malau. These birds are central place foragers. This means they return to the same location once they're adults. And this makes it easier for us to follow their life history of individuals in our study areas. They can swim an average of 2 to 4 kilometres an hour. They do spend most of their time at sea, but they can get up to around 12 kilometres an hour. The average dive depth is between 10 and 30 metres, but have been recorded up to 72 metres and can do this up to a couple of thousand times a day, which is a fair old effort for a very little bird. This is quite a simplified breakdown of their annual cycle. It doesn't quite fit as neatly into this as most wildlife doesn't. But if we start with their molting season, the little penguins go through what is called a catastrophic molt. So they'll lose their entire set of feathers and then regrow a new set all at one time. So before they do this, they need to fatten up. They need to get to around about 1.5 kilos, that might be. And then they'll spend up to about 17 days on land while they complete this cycle. Obviously, once they're losing their feathers, they're no longer waterproof and can't feed. After this, they'll go through what's called an autumn breed. They've shed their feathers, they're looking fabulous, they're out getting frisky with their friends. Usually though, the weather starts cooling down, the water starts cooling down, and the penguins will abandon any eggs that they've laid. We have, however, in the last couple of years found some penguins actually raising chicks through to fledging stage. So watch this space, it may change. After this, they'll spend extended periods of time out at sea fishing, and they'll only come onto land every now and again. And then once we hit around the July-August period, they'll start coming back onto land, pairing up again with their partners. They are a socially monogamous bird. However, they are sexually promiscuous. They know how to have a good time. So once these birds have paired up, they've got their burrows going, they'll go through their egg incubation and onto the breeding season. Now, importantly for what we'll talk about a bit further on, the breeding season and the molting season often overlap, and this is during summer. So heat waves will play a part in this. So the Nature Parks has a wildlife shelter which is located on Summerland Peninsula, so right at the doorstep of the little penguin colony. This clinic was purpose-built to care for penguins affected by large marine pollution events, heat stress events, and fire. See, on average, about 140 penguins a year. This can change quite dramatically from one year to the next. We might see as few as 70 or much higher than this. The clinic also sees around 450 to 500 other wildlife native to Phillip Island. Phillip Island has seen several oil spills over the years. Some of you may have even been part of the response to that. The last one that affected a lot of penguins was back in 2001 on a south coast rocky beach where 438 little penguins were affected. So why are the penguins presenting? This is looking at that 12-year period that we'll be looking at the study with. Majority of the cases are unknown. We can work out injuries, we can work out illnesses, but why they happened, we can't know. So by and large, it's unknown. We also have quite a large cohort that are found exhausted. In this grouping will also be heat-affected penguins. None of the above down there is probably more representative of things like grass seeds in eyes and other eye injuries. So the injuries they're coming in with, it's quite often a combination of these injuries. It's not usually just one, but as we heard with Dr. Anne Fowler's talk, malnourishment is by and large the greatest reason we're getting these birds presenting, and unfortunately a lot of these are at the stage of severe emaciation. The next greatest category is damaged limbs, broken limbs, abrasions, cuts. Little penguins are prone to things like propeller injuries, also entanglements. And this isn't always with, as you'd expect, netting or fishing line or something like that. It can also be in native vegetation. So these little penguins are travelling to and from the ocean and will be climbing through all sorts of things. So not always what you'd expect. So with the fates, unfortunately, you'll see a large number of death by injury or illness. A large number of these birds that present are already in an incredibly compromised state, and often these birds will die before we have the chance to intervene. There are also plenty of cases too where we'll be trying to bring them back and it just doesn't pan out, unfortunately. We do, however, have a pretty good success rate, and you'll see that we've got released at location found and also released not at location found. This is simply our government guidelines. This is how all of this is categorised. So a penguin might be found in a suburb where there's no colony on Phillip Island, but they will be released at the same area as all the other birds. This is still within their foraging grounds. So what impacts do the changing climate have on little penguins? There are negative impacts on their food supply. The temperature at sea dictates where the food is. It can mix up the water column, which makes prey harder to find. Warmer water outside the prey's comfort zone will push that penguin food further away. And this causes the penguins to have to travel a lot further to find food, or they may not be able to find it if it's mixed up in the water column. If it's breeding season, this has the knock-on effect that the chicks will be less likely to survive as well. El Niño can also affect the spawning events of the prey species of the little penguins. There's an increased severity and occurrence of heat stress events during heat waves. This results in a much higher penguin mortality. There's also the increased risk of more frequent and more severe fire events, as we've heard a lot about today already. The upper thermal zone of the little penguin is around the 27-degree mark. So once we start getting above this temperature, the birds are going to start to be at risk of heat stress. If it's during breeding season, the chicks in the burrows are going to be the ones most at risk. If it's during the molting season, then it's going to be your molting birds that are stuck and restricted on land that are going to be most at risk. These are also, it's important to note that it's the more successful, larger penguins that are going to be more at risk during these heat wave events, because the larger the bird, the higher the temperature naturally is going to be, and so it takes less of an increase to tip these birds over the edge. There's also an increased risk of disease. So the climate change alters the ecosystem properties, which allows the disease-carrying vectors to establish where historically the climate may have been unsuitable. So this is a case study of a heatwave back in early 2019. We had 4 days above 35 degrees Celsius. Probably doesn't sound like much here in WA, but in Phillip Island, it is. These birds aren't set up for these kind of temperatures. Also important to note that the overnight temperatures didn't drop below 20 degrees. This means that the birds that are compromised during the day don't have the chance to recover overnight with a nice cool night before they hit again the next day with another hot one. These events are likely to become more frequent, and the penguins, when they're in the terrestrial environment like this, are more at risk. You'll also see a couple of photos is some non-typical behaviour of little penguins. They will normally, during the day, be tucked away in burrows or out at sea. It's very dangerous for them to be out in the open during the day. During this heat wave, we found that some of the birds that had burrows close to the water's edge were actually coming out through the day, crossing the beach and swimming, I guess, in the shallows of the water, even though they weren't waterproof, to cool themselves down, and then they were returning back to their burrows. So this worked really effectively for these penguins, and thankfully none of these birds succumbed to the heat. But it will be interesting to see in future if this behaviour starts to become more common. We had a mortality of 100 adult penguins during this few days. 30 of the penguins were admitted to the wildlife clinic, and 22 of those birds were released successfully. So with the increase of these events in mind, we wanted to determine, given the specialised facilities and staff, the time and financial input, whether rehabilitating penguins was beneficial long term. We know we're releasing them, but is it working long term? Several studies have been done post-release in oil spills, but the data is lacking on day-to-day rehab post-release success. So this study looks at a 12-year period. We've gone with 2005 to 2017. During this time, 658 little penguins met the criteria and were successfully released. So these birds determined our sample size for the study. So what did we have to work with? Ideally, we would have loved to put transponders on every penguin that's released and track them from there. We didn't have the money to do that, especially not post-COVID. So we're looking at the data that we have. We're lucky enough to have the largest penguin colony on our doorstep. We have over 55 years of research. That's a really large amount of data, and that's been thanks to a penguin study group, volunteers, scientists, and students. We also have over 35 years of wildlife rehabilitation data collected by our dedicated staff and volunteers. So of these 658 birds, 107 were going to be suitable. These were the only birds that met the criteria for the study. The penguins had to be adults. The chicks have a high mortality, and they also have the potential to move to another colony. So they had to be seen as an adult in the colony healthy before. Then they had to have been recovered and released from their illness or injury. And then they needed to be seen again healthy in the colony. But what are we going to compare these birds to? So we have our long-term research. There's a really large number of research burrows around the Penguin Parade area. There's some all around Summerland Peninsula, but these are the ones that we concentrated on for this study. We took a random sample of 107 birds out of this large pool of data. This was repeated 5 times and then averaged, and these were our control birds. These birds had to have been seen healthy in the colony, and then they had to have been resighted again during the period of this 12 years of the study. And here you can see Paula Wozniak, who is, you'll hear later, the initiator of this study. So the resightings, 49% of our clinic birds were resighted again in the colony post-release. This compares to 64% of our control group. Lots of reasons why that number might be a lot lower, but taken at face value, it means that around 76% of the rehabbed birds were just as likely to survive long-term as the non-rehabbed birds. So of the resighted clinic birds, over half were seen actively contributing to the population through breeding. And there were several breeding attempts through that time. And these birds were sighted on average for about 4 years post-release. The breeding success here is significant. There's been an issue post-oil spill release on breeding, so this is really great to know. So rehab is part of the puzzle, but not the only part. So the other things that we're doing at the nature parks to try and mitigate some of these threats of the warming climate. Emergency response planning, we've heard about that earlier today. We spend a lot of time on emergency response planning. We have exercises to test these plans. We conduct training and courses for staff, our staff, also interagency organisations and volunteers. We have a lot of research partnerships and collaboration, resident scientists, visiting scientists and students, all working on projects such as erosion and sand movement. This is important when you're looking at the penguins' access to their burrows. We do GPS tracking, marine spatial planning, finding feeding hotspots for little penguins. And we can do this using technology such as a sailing drone, which measures the water temperature, fish abundancy, and salinity. And this way we're able to find out how much food is available in penguins' foraging grounds, which affects their long-term foraging and breeding success. We're also looking at the terrestrial effects of heat waves, the vegetation types. Not all vegetation is created equal when it comes to temperature. Poa grasslands are a much higher temperature in a heat event than our local bower spinach, which is a succulent species which keeps them cooler. Also looking at nest box designs and trying to find out whether through little alterations we can cool that temperature in their nest boxes. So this research feeds into our habitat restoration and management projects. The Summerlands housing estate was rehabilitated back to native vegetation after all those houses were removed. We have a resilience project at the moment on the Summerland Peninsula, where we're manipulating the vegetation in order to increase penguin habitat, the bird succulent herbland, making it cooler for them for these events so that hopefully they're not going to be as affected by the heat stress. And we're also creating green fire breaks to try and slow the spread of wildfire. We also have ongoing weed and revegetation programs as well. Alongside this, importantly, we have our vertebrate pest control program. Fox eradication was declared in 2017 on Phillip Island. Really important to maintain this status, of course. So we have ongoing monitoring of foxes on Phillip Island and also on a mainland buffer so that we can reduce the risk of reinvasion. We have feral cat monitoring and control across sites, including the Summerland Peninsula. We've got 2 fox detection and 2 cat detection dogs, and these are used to track fresh scent across the landscape in response to sightings, but it's also used to undertake proactive surveys. This program reduces the additional pressures from fox and cat predation. Wildlife is, of course, particularly at risk of this after fire or when exhibiting these non-typical behaviours of being out in daytime during a heat wave. So, summing up, although significantly different, the long-term results are encouraging. Suggests that almost half the birds rescued can potentially be rehabilitated and returned to the breeding population, helping to mitigate the increasing threats in both the marine and the terrestrial environments. So in answer to our question, yes, given all the specialised facilities and staff, the time and financial input, rehabilitating penguins on Malau is definitely beneficial long-term. Day-to-day rehab is also important to maintain the skills needed to respond to these increasing emergency events. Climate change will undoubtedly have profound long-term effects on penguins, not only through impacts on productivity regimes and food webs, but also through the spread and introduction of new diseases and toxic poisoning to potentially naive penguin populations with probably a low resistance. I'd like to thank the AWRC for organising another brilliant event. And I'd also like to acknowledge Paula Wozniak, who we saw in the slide earlier, for initiating and leading this study, and Rose Bolsch for her work on data analysis to help answer these questions. I'd also like to acknowledge our conservation team for their dedication and impactful work managing and protecting the wildlife and environment on Malau. Please get in touch if you have any ideas or comments or any questions. Thank you.